My name is Madison. I'm 36 years old, the middle child in a family that has always been louder than I am. I live in Seattle now, work in finance, and on paper, my life looks structured, predictable, even a little boring. I prefer it that way. Most people describe me as steady, which is a polite way of saying I don't demand attention. In my family, that translated into something else. It meant I was the reliable one, the one who would pick up the phone at midnight, the one who would quietly transfer money if someone was short, the one who didn't argue when plans changed, when credit shifted, when stories were retold slightly differently each year at Thanksgiving. I wasn't invisible, but I was background. This story isn't about explosive arguments or dramatic confrontations. It's not about revenge in the way people usually mean it. There was no screaming across hospital corridors, no shattered plates, no courtroom theatrics. It's about something smaller, and in many ways more permanent. When my mother needed surgery, urgent, expensive, terrifying surgery, our family fractured in subtle ways. Fear does that. Pressure reveals the architecture of relationships. And in the middle of that pressure, my older brother stepped forward publicly. He told relatives, friends, and even posted online about how he was handling the financial side, about how he was making sure mom was taken care of. People praised him, they thanked him, they called him a good son. And I watched, because the truth was quieter. The truth was documented. The truth had a receipt. I funded the surgery, every dollar of it, from my savings account, transferred in 3 installments over 2 weeks while still paying my own mortgage and pretending everything was fine. I didn't correct him at first. I told myself it didn't matter, that mom's recovery mattered more than recognition, that family harmony was worth swallowing one more small distortion, but recognition should follow the receipt. This isn't a story about exposing someone to destroy them. It's about what happens when you decide that silence is no longer generosity. It's permission. It's about the moment you realize that being the good one has quietly cost you your own narrative. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how I went from the invisible daughter to the woman who released a single bank transfer screenshot and changed the dynamic of my entire family without raising her voice once. No shouting, no cruelty, just documentation. Have you ever stayed quiet so long that people started believing the wrong version of you was the real one? In my family, identity was assigned early and rarely updated. My older brother, Daniel, was the leader, charismatic, confident, the one who spoke first at restaurants and negotiated car prices like he was performing for an audience. My younger sister, Chloe, was the heart, emotionally expressive, always hugging someone or crying during commercials. And me? I was the responsible one. It sounds like a compliment. It usually is. But in our house, it came with a quiet condition. Responsible people don't need recognition. They just handle things. If a bill was confusing, I read it. If a form needed filling out, I filled it. If mom couldn't remember a password, she called me. No one announced these moments. They just happened, and I stepped into them the way water fills a shape. At family gatherings, Daniel told stories, big ones, animated ones. Stories where he was decisive, heroic, and indispensable. And often, those stories had side characters. I usually, in the background. Madison helped with the paperwork, he'd say casually, already moving on to the part where he made the bold call. It wasn't inaccurate, just incomplete. I told myself it didn't matter. I was good at seeing the long game. Credit was noise. Stability was substance. I built my career the same way. Quietly outperforming projections, quietly earning promotions, quietly becoming the person executives trusted with sensitive accounts. In the office, that restraint read as competence. At home, it read as availability. If Daniel needed a short-term loan between business ventures, and there were several, I was the one he called. He always paid me back, eventually, with gratitude that sounded sincere enough to make me feel guilty for tracking the dates. Thanks, Mads. Don't know what I'd do without you. That sentence followed me for years. I didn't resent him. Not then. I genuinely believed this was a balance. He had social capital. I had financial capital. He shone publicly. I stabilized privately. And maybe that would have been fine if the exchange had been equal. But over time, something subtle formed. A pattern. In conversations about family decisions, Daniel spoke for us. About investments, about logistics, about what we'll do, as if my input were assumed but not required verbally. When relatives praised him for being proactive, He rarely corrected them. When Mom said, "Daniel's always taking charge," I would smile and refill her water. I wasn't being silenced, I was being edited. And because I never protested, the edits became canon. By my mid-30s, I had a stable 6-figure income, a paid-off car, and a savings account built deliberately over 15 years. No flashy lifestyle, no risky ventures, just disciplined growth. I didn't talk about numbers at family dinners. Money made people uncomfortable, and I had learned early that competence can intimidate if you don't soften it. So I softened it. I downplayed bonuses. I described my job as just spreadsheets. I laughed when Daniel called me the family accountant. It was easier to let them underestimate me than to correct them, until the day underestimation turned into appropriation, until the day my mother's health became a headline, until the day my name disappeared from a story that involved my entire savings account. Looking back, I can see that I had been rehearsing for that moment my whole life. Every quiet observation, every documented transfer, every time I chose composure over correction. Because when you're underestimated long enough, you learn something powerful. You learn that silence is information. The first small cut didn't happen at the hospital. It happened online. Mom's diagnosis came fast. An arterial blockage that required surgery within weeks. The word urgent changes the temperature of a family. Daniel took charge immediately. He created a group chat titled Mom Strong. He called the surgeons. He spoke to the insurance. He updated his cousins. I handled the numbers. The insurance would cover a portion, but not all. There were out-of-network fees, specialist fees, recovery costs. The estimate, after everything, was just over $86,000. I didn't hesitate. I had the liquidity. Years of disciplined saving, conservative investing, and deferred vacations. I wired the first $30,000 the same afternoon we received the breakdown. 2 more transfers followed over the next 10 days. I didn't announce it. I simply sent Daniel the confirmation numbers and asked him to coordinate with the hospital billing department. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. 3 days later, while I was reviewing quarterly reports at work, my phone buzzed nonstop. Notifications, messages, tags. Daniel had posted on Facebook a photo of him sitting beside Mom's hospital bed, holding her hand. The caption read, "No matter what it costs, I'll always take care of my mother. Surgery fully covered. Family first." Below it, comments flooded in. "You're such a good son. She's lucky to have you. Real men step up. So proud of you, Daniel." I stared at the words, "surgery fully covered." My bank app still showed the outgoing transfers. It wasn't technically a lie. The surgery was fully covered, but not by him. I told myself to breathe. Social media exaggerates. People simplify. Maybe he meant we. Maybe he didn't think about the phrasing. Still, something tightened in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Recognition doesn't always need applause. But erasure feels different from modesty. I waited. Hours passed. The comments grew. He responded to nearly all of them. Anything for Mom. Couldn't let her worry about money. Handled. Handled. That word lingered. In the group chat, he forwarded screenshots of relatives praising him. Chloe sent heart emojis. Mom, from her hospital bed, texted, "My hero." I watched the message appear on my screen. "My hero." I imagined correcting it, typing calmly. Actually, I transferred the funds. Daniel coordinated logistics. It would have been factual, neutral, clean, but the timing felt cruel. Mom was scared. The surgery was in 48 hours. Did credit matter more than her peace of mind? I chose silence, not because I didn't notice, but I prioritized stability over accuracy. That was the first cut. Small enough to ignore, sharp enough to feel. That night, I opened my laptop and saved the transfer confirmations into a folder labeled Medical Mom 2024. I printed copies and placed them into my black leather portfolio. Not out of spite, out of habit. Documentation is protection. In finance, you learn early. If it isn't recorded, it didn't happen. Still, I told myself this wasn't about protection. It was about organization, about taxes, about future reimbursement possibilities. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe after surgery, he would clarify. Maybe in person, he would mention it. But as days passed, the narrative solidified. The extended family began telling the story back to us, already simplified. Daniel stepped up. Each retelling sanded my presence down further. And the most unsettling part, no one was trying to hurt me. They just didn't think to look beyond the loudest voice. That was when I understood something uncomfortable. Invisibility isn't always imposed. Sometimes it's reinforced by the one who refuses to interrupt it. The first small cut wasn't public praise. It was my decision to let it stand. Mom's surgery was successful. The relief that followed was so overwhelming that it almost erased everything else. For a few weeks, our family existed in gratitude. Daniel brought flowers to the hospital. Chloe stayed overnight during recovery. I coordinated post-operative bills, physical therapy payments, and prescription schedules. Everyone played their part, and the story, Daniel as financial savior, quietly hardened. It came up at the first family dinner after Mom returned home. My Aunt Linda hugged him tightly and said, "You took such a weight off all of us. Covering that surgery like that? Not everyone would." Daniel smiled in that modest way he had perfected. A slight shrug, a softened voice. "You do what you have to for family." I was sitting 3 chairs away. No one looked at me. No one asked how the transfers were structured, or how insurance reimbursements would be processed, or who was managing the remaining $4,200 in miscellaneous charges that kept arriving in thin white envelopes. I was cutting chicken into small pieces for Mom. That was the second layer of the cut, not just the original post, but the repetition, the normalization. At some point, a single exaggeration becomes collective memory. I told myself it wasn't malicious. Daniel had always been comfortable in the spotlight. He probably didn't see it as stealing credit. In his mind, coordinating equaled providing. Effort equaled ownership. And maybe that's how he justified it. What unsettled me more was how easy it was for everyone else to accept that version. It fit the character they already believed in. Daniel the protector, Madison the helper. In quiet moments, I began noticing patterns I had previously dismissed. When Mom told neighbors about her surgery, she said, "Daniel made sure everything was paid for." When relatives sent thank you texts, they were directed to him. He forwarded some of them to me once with a simple message. "Couldn't have done it without you. Without you. Not because of you." The distinction is subtle, but language shapes hierarchy. I rationalized my silence in logical steps. Mom is recovering. Don't disturb her peace. Daniel probably doesn't even realize how it sounds. This isn't about ego. Money is an identity. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the glow of my laptop reflected against the living room window, I would open the bank statements again. 3 transfers, $30,000, $30,000, $26,000, $86,000. Years of discipline condensed into 3 lines of confirmation numbers. And my name existed nowhere in the story. That was when something uncomfortable surfaced. Not anger at Daniel, but disappointment in myself. I had participated in my own erasure. Every time someone praised him, and I stayed silent, I reinforced the narrative. Every time I smiled and changed the subject, I edited myself out a little more. Silence, I realized, is rarely neutral. It communicates consent. And in this case, it communicated that I was comfortable being background support in a moment that had cost me something significant. The dissonance began to grow. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. At work, I negotiated multi-million-dollar allocations and ensured my contributions were properly documented in reports. I corrected misattributions professionally and calmly. I understood the importance of credit in environments where compensation and influence were tied to measurable outcomes. But at home, I defaulted to humility. Why? Because somewhere along the line, I had internalized that demanding recognition in family spaces felt selfish. That love should be unconditional and unaccounted for. Yet I couldn't ignore a simple truth forming quietly in my mind. Recognition should follow the receipt, not for applause, not for status, but for accuracy. And accuracy matters. By the time the third retelling happened, this time at a neighborhood barbecue where Daniel recounted how he handled the financial burden, I didn't feel hurt anymore. I felt clarity. And clarity is far more dangerous than resentment. Because resentment reacts. Clarity decides. There's a moment in every family when you realize your role isn't temporary. It's structural. For me, that realization didn't arrive in a dramatic confrontation. It came on a quiet Sunday afternoon while I was sitting at my dining table, sorting through medical invoices that continued to trickle in weeks after Mom's surgery. Daniel had stopped mentioning the finances altogether. In his mind, the major event was over. He had been praised. Mom was healing, the narrative had settled. But the bills were still arriving at my address, because when the hospital asked for a responsible financial contact, he had given them my name. Not maliciously, not even strategically, just automatically. That was my role. The closer, the one who makes things actually happen. I stared at the stack of envelopes and realized something unsettling. No one had ever formally asked me to take on that role. It had simply been assumed, reinforced, repeated until it became an expectation. When Daniel needed seed money for his first startup attempt, I wired $12,000. When that folded, I didn't mention it at Thanksgiving. When he pivoted to a consulting opportunity and needed a short bridge loan, I structured it with repayment terms, gently, diplomatically, like I was doing him a favor by being organized. He called me cautious. My family called me practical. What they meant was predictable. And predictability is comfortable for everyone except the predictable one. I began replaying old conversations in my mind. Madison will figure it out. She's good with money. Let's just ask her. There was always warmth in those statements. Appreciation, even. But appreciation without acknowledgement of cost is simply convenience dressed politely. The surgery had amplified everything. It wasn't just about money. It was about narrative ownership. Daniel embodied action publicly. I executed outcomes privately. And because I never corrected the imbalance matured. One evening, I visited Mom alone. She was sitting in her recliner, a blanket over her legs, sunlight catching in her graying hair. She looked smaller after surgery, fragile in a way that made everything feel heavier. She squeezed my hand. "I don't know what I'd do without your brother," she said softly. "He's so strong." There was no manipulation in her voice, just sincerity. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. She believed the version she had been shown. I could have corrected her. The truth was simple. The transfers were documented. The statements existed. But I didn't, because I understood something deeper. This wasn't just about one surgery. It was about a decades-old script where Daniel was the visible shield and I was the invisible infrastructure. The role assigned to me was reliable, useful, and invisible. And here's the part that hurt most. I had accepted it, not consciously, not enthusiastically, but consistently. I had mistaken low drama for peace. I had mistaken silence for strength. I had mistaken humility for virtue, even when it cost me authorship of my own actions. That night, I opened my black leather portfolio again. I reviewed every confirmation page. I added the remaining invoices. I created a clean digital folder with timestamps, reference numbers, and PDF exports directly from the bank. Not because I planned to attack anyone, but because for the first time, I understood the power of having a complete record when everyone else relied on memory. Roles feel permanent until you decide to renegotiate them. And renegotiation doesn't require yelling. It requires leverage. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking how to keep the peace. I was asking a different question. What happens if I stop protecting a narrative that doesn't protect me? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It happened during applause. About 2 months after Mom's surgery, our extended family organized a small celebration dinner. Nothing extravagant, just a private room at a neighborhood Italian restaurant. Mom was walking more comfortably. Her color had returned. It felt like the closing chapter of a stressful season. There were toasts. Chloe cried halfway through hers. My Aunt Linda passed tissues. Glasses clinked. Someone ordered another bottle of wine. And then Daniel stood. He had always been good at this part. Confident posture, one hand lightly resting on the back of Mom's chair. A voice calibrated perfectly between humility and pride. "I just did what any son would do," he said. "When you realize how fragile life is, you don't hesitate. You step up, you handle it." Applause followed. It wasn't thunderous, but it was warm, affirming. I felt my body react before my mind did. Not anger, something quieter. A stillness, as if my nervous system had decided to stop negotiating with reality. Because in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. He believed his version. He wasn't lying strategically. He had absorbed the praise so completely that it reshaped his memory. In his internal narrative, coordinating equaled covering. Visibility equaled provision. And my silence had helped him believe it. I looked around the table. Mom was glowing. Chloe was nodding proudly. Relatives were smiling at Daniel like he had carried something heavy alone. No one looked confused. No one looked uncertain. The story was complete, and for the first time, instead of feeling small, I felt separate, detached from the script. I thought about the hours I had spent building that savings account, the dinners I declined, the trips I postponed, the promotions I negotiated carefully to increase my liquidity margin, the risk calculations I ran before initiating those transfers. $86,000 is not symbolic. It is tangible. It represents choices. And I had made those choices deliberately. That night, as applause faded and conversation resumed, I didn't correct him. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't offer a counter toast. Instead, I observed Daniel's comfort in the spotlight. My family's comfort in a simplified story. My own long-standing comfort in being uncredited. And then I felt something new. Not resentment. Resolve. The shift wasn't about exposing him. It wasn't about embarrassing anyone. It wasn't even about rewriting the past. It was about the future. If I stayed silent again, the pattern would calcify permanently. The next time something large happened, another medical issue, a financial crisis, an inheritance conversation, my contribution would once again be absorbed quietly into his narrative, and I would have participated in that absorption. On the drive home, the city lights blurred across my windshield. I didn't turn on the music. I let the silence sit. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What do I lose by telling the truth calmly? Not emotionally, not publicly, just factually. The answer surprised me. I wouldn't lose love. If love were real, it would survive accuracy. I wouldn't lose dignity. Silence was what had been eroding it. I might lose comfort. I might lose someone's curated image. But those were not mine to maintain. That was the moment something fundamental shifted. I stopped thinking about preserving harmony at any cost, and I started thinking about balance. Recognition should follow the receipt, not for applause, for alignment. By the time I parked in my driveway, I knew one thing clearly. I wasn't going to argue, but I wasn't going to disappear again either. After that dinner, I didn't change outwardly. That was the first strategic decision. I still answered Mom's calls. I still coordinated with the hospital billing department. I still showed up to Sunday lunches. But internally, something was different. My silence was no longer automatic. It was deliberate. There's a subtle but powerful difference between being quiet because you feel small and being quiet because you are observing. I began watching patterns more carefully. Daniel continued telling the surgery story in polished fragments. At a neighbor's housewarming party, I overheard him say, "It drained me financially, but she's worth it." He even laughed lightly, as if the sacrifice had been noble but manageable. Drained, I noted the word. Meanwhile, I was restructuring my own monthly allocations to rebuild the $86,000 I had moved out of my savings. I cut discretionary spending further, increased automatic investments, adjusted my quarterly bonus projections. Not because I was struggling, but because I refused to let generosity destabilize me. What changed most wasn't my behavior. It was my response to praise directed at him. I stopped smiling automatically. Not dramatically, not coldly, just neutrally. When someone said, "Daniel really stepped up," I would respond calmly. It was a team effort, a small sentence, balanced, accurate. I didn't elaborate, I didn't claim, I didn't accuse, but I stopped reinforcing the singular hero narrative. And interestingly, that subtle shift made people slightly uncomfortable. When you remove emotional validation from a false assumption, the assumption wobbles. Daniel noticed it first. One evening, he called me. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "I've always been quiet." A pause. "I just don't want any weirdness about the surgery stuff," he added casually. "You know, I didn't mean it like I paid every single dollar alone. People just interpret things." There it was, a soft preemptive defense. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. "I understand," I said. "Clarity matters, though." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course," he replied. But his tone shifted, less relaxed, more cautious. Silence had become leverage, because now he sensed something without knowing what, and that uncertainty unsettled him more than confrontation would have. At work, I've learned something about power. The person who reacts emotionally gives information away. The person who observes retains control. So I observed. I reviewed our text messages from the weeks of the surgery, screenshots of him asking for transfer confirmation, his acknowledgement messages. The timestamps align with my bank statements. Everything was clean. No ambiguity, no shared account confusion, just facts. And facts don't shout. They sit patiently. What surprised me most during this period wasn't his behavior. It was my own calm. I expected anger to surface. I expected bitterness. But instead I felt steady. Because once you stop needing validation, you become very difficult to manipulate. Daniel mistook my quiet for retreat. In reality, it was positioning. I wasn't planning a dramatic reveal. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I was waiting for the right context. Because truth delivered impulsively feels reactive. Truth delivered precisely feels undeniable. And I had learned something over the years in finance. Timing isn't about speed. It's about inevitability. Silence, when chosen intentionally, becomes space. And in that space, clarity sharpens. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking for recognition. I was preparing for alignment. What no one noticed about me, what they had never needed to notice, was that I am most active when I appear still. After the dinner, after Daniel's careful phone call about weirdness, I didn't escalate anything. I didn't hint at confrontation. I didn't even correct extended relatives when they repeated the polished version of events. Instead, I prepared, not emotionally, structurally. The first thing I did was request a full billing ledger from the hospital. Every charge, every payment, every timestamp. I wanted an official document showing exactly how the surgery had been funded and from which account. Hospitals are meticulous. The ledger listed my name as the remitting party on all 3 transfers. My bank's routing number was partially visible. The payment confirmations matched my saved PDFs down to the second. Clean. Then I organized the information chronologically. Initial cost estimate, my email to Daniel asking for billing instructions, his reply with hospital wiring details, transfer confirmations, hospital acknowledgement receipts, follow-up invoices, into final balance statement, $0, no interpretation, no commentary, just sequence. I printed everything and placed it in my black leather portfolio. Then, I created a mirrored digital folder in cloud storage, backed up twice. This wasn't paranoia. It was precision. At the same time, I quietly made another adjustment. I stopped being the automatic financial bridge. When Daniel mentioned a new opportunity requiring temporary liquidity, I didn't decline dramatically. I asked for a formal proposal, projected returns, repayment schedule with interest. He laughed. "Since when are you so corporate with me?" "Since it's money," I replied calmly. He didn't pursue it further. That was the second shift. He began feeling the difference before he could name it. Meanwhile, the extended family began planning a larger Thanksgiving gathering. Someone suggested recognizing everyone who helped Mom through her recovery. Daniel volunteered to give a short speech. Of course he did. I listened to the planning call quietly, and that was when I realized something important. The narrative was about to be solidified publicly again, this time in front of 30 relatives instead of a restaurant table. If I remained silent during that event, the story would become permanent family history. It would be retold at anniversaries, at future crises, at my own hypothetical wedding someday. Memory calcifies through repetition, and once something is canon in a family, correcting it later feels like revisionism. I didn't want to revise history. I wanted it recorded the first time accurately. So I considered my options carefully. Confront him privately beforehand. Risk defensive denial. Correct him mid-speech. Risk public embarrassment and emotional chaos. Stay silent. Reinforce the distortion permanently. None of those felt aligned with who I am. Then I noticed something small but powerful. At Thanksgiving, one cousin had offered to create a shared digital photo album and slideshow from the year, including hospital photos, recovery updates, and family milestones. A slideshow, documented moments, public display, structured narrative. And that's when I understood the leverage I had. Not anger, not an accusation, documentation. What they never noticed about me was this: I don't fight stories with emotion. I correct them with the records. I volunteered to help assemble the slideshow. Of course you did, Daniel said lightly on the group call. You're organized like that. Yes, I am. What he didn't realize was that organization is power when the truth is on your side. That week I began drafting a single slide. No dramatic headline, no passive-aggressive commentary. Just a screenshot of one of the bank transfers with sensitive numbers blurred, clearly showing from Madison C. Whitaker, amount $30,000. Purpose, medical payment, surgical services. Underneath it, a simple caption. Grateful we could come together to cover Mom's surgery. Not I, not me, not he. Just evidence. Neutral. Unavoidable. The power of quiet dominance isn't in humiliation. It's in alignment, and alignment was coming. The leverage didn't feel triumphant. It felt steady. As I assembled the Thanksgiving slideshow, I kept the tone consistent. Photos of Mom smiling in her hospital bed, Chloe braiding her hair during recovery, and Daniel carrying grocery bags into the house. No one looked like a villain. No one looked exaggerated. I refused to distort anything. That's important. Quiet dominance only works when your hands are clean. When I added the financial slide, I hesitated for less than a second. Not out of doubt, but out of precision. I blurred the account numbers carefully, left only the necessary identifiers: name, date, amount, description. Underneath, the caption remained simple: grateful we could come together to cover Mom's surgery. Not confrontational, not emotional, just factual. Then I exported the full slideshow into a shared drive so everyone organizing the event could preview it in advance, including Daniel. I didn't text him about it. I didn't highlight the slide. I just uploaded it. 42 minutes later, my phone rang. He didn't bother with small talk. "What's that slide about the transfer?" His voice wasn't angry. It was controlled. But I could hear the recalibration happening in real time. "It's part of the timeline," I said calmly. "We're showing how everything came together." Silence. "You didn't have to put that in there." "I didn't have to leave it out either." Another silence. Longer. "It makes it look like I didn't contribute." "I didn't say that." The difference between accusation and implication is restraint. I let the space breathe. He tried again. "People don't need to see bank statements, Madison. It's not a statement, it's a confirmation, and it's blurred." "You know what I mean." Yes, I did. For the first time since the surgery, he understood something clearly. I had documentation, and I was willing to let it exist publicly without drama. Not as an attack, as context. He shifted strategies. I just didn't think we were keeping score. There it was, the familiar framing, as if accuracy were a competition, as if transparency were pettiness. "I'm not keeping score," I replied. "I'm keeping records." That sentence changed the energy of the call, because records are neutral. They don't argue, they exist. Another pause. "You're making this bigger than it is," he said finally. "No," I answered, "I'm making it accurate." And then I stopped speaking. Silence when your calm becomes pressure. Not aggressive pressure, just undeniable weight. He exhaled audibly. "So what? You want me to announce something at Thanksgiving?" "I want the slideshow to reflect reality. Nothing more. Nothing less." We ended the call without a resolution. He didn't ask me to remove the slide. I didn't offer to. And in that quiet aftermath, something settled inside me. This wasn't about exposing him to shame him. It was about releasing myself from complicity. The private reveal wasn't the slide. It was the realization that I was no longer afraid of discomfort. I had spent years protecting harmony by absorbing distortion. Now I was protecting the truth by allowing documentation to exist. No shouting, no ultimatums, just clarity. For the first time, the leverage wasn't in my bank account. It was in my composure. And once someone knows you are calm with evidence, the balance shifts permanently. Thanksgiving arrived with its usual choreography. Oven timers, overlapping conversations, the scent of rosemary and butter filling my mother's house. On the surface, everything felt normal. Daniel greeted relatives at the door with confident warmth. Chloe adjusted place cards. Mom sat near the window, wrapped in a soft cardigan, smiling in that relieved way people do when they've survived something significant. The slideshow was scheduled to play after dinner. I had 3 choices. Remove the financial slide quietly and preserve comfort. Announce the truth verbally and risk emotional escalation. Let the documentation speak for itself. The third option felt irreversible, because once something is seen collectively, it cannot be unseen. I moved through the afternoon calmly, helped carve the turkey, refilled drinks, answered polite questions about work. No one sensed the weight of the decision resting quietly in my chest. After dessert, my cousin dimmed the lights and connected her laptop to the television. Laughter filled the room as early photos appeared. Mom in recovery, Chloe asleep in a chair, Daniel making exaggerated, thumbs-up faces beside hospital equipment. The mood was warm, nostalgic. I watched Daniel carefully. He seemed relaxed, almost reassured. Perhaps he believed I had reconsidered. Slide after slide advanced. Then the timeline section began. Hospital estimate, insurance summary, family group chat screenshot, cropped to show coordination, nothing sensitive. And then the transfer confirmation. From Madison C. Whitaker, amount $30,000. Medical payment, surgical services. The room didn't gasp. There was no dramatic reaction. There was something subtler. Stillness. People read, processing quietly. Then the next slide. Second transfer, third transfer. Final balance statement, $0 owed. Underneath, grateful we could come together to cover Mom's surgery. I didn't look at Daniel immediately. I looked at my mother. Her eyes moved slowly across the screen. Confusion first, then recalibration, then understanding. The silence in the room wasn't hostile. It was cognitive. A collective adjustment of memory. My aunt spoke first. "Oh," she said softly. "Madison, you handled the payments?" "Handled." The word landed differently this time. "I transferred the funds," I said evenly. Daniel coordinated logistics with the hospital. Accurate. Balanced. No edge in my voice. Daniel shifted in his seat. I mean, we both did our parts, he added quickly. His tone was careful now, stripped of its earlier certainty. No one accused him. No one attacked him. But something invisible had shifted. The narrative had widened, and once widened, it could not narrow back to a single hero. That was the decision point. I had chosen documentation over confrontation. I had chosen clarity over comfort, and in doing so, I had crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. I was no longer participating in my own erasure. The slideshow continued. Laughter eventually returned. Conversation resumed, but the atmosphere had changed subtly, like air pressure after a storm passes. Daniel was quieter for the rest of the evening. Not angry, measured, because for the first time, he understood that I was willing to let facts exist publicly, not as weapons, as records. Recognition should follow the receipt, and now it did. The interesting thing about correction without confrontation is that it doesn't explode. It settles. In the days after Thanksgiving, no one called to argue. No one sent defensive texts. There were no late-night accusations. But the temperature had changed. Mom called me 2 mornings later. Her voice was softer than usual. Madison, she said, I didn't realize. I mean, I knew you were helping, but I didn't know you had covered that much. That much. It wasn't about the exact number. It was about scale. I didn't want you worrying about it, I replied. The priority was your recovery. There was a pause. I could hear her processing, not guilt exactly, but adjustment. Thank you, she said finally. I should have asked more questions. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is currency. Daniel didn't call immediately. Instead, he sent a short message 3 days later. Didn't think the slide was necessary, but I get your point. I read it twice. Not necessary. Necessary is subjective. Accurate is not. I wasn't making a point, I replied, just clarifying the record. He didn't respond. And that silence told me more than any argument would have. Because when someone realizes the narrative is no longer exclusively theirs to shape, they have to recalibrate their posture. That recalibration takes time. Meanwhile, I made quite structural adjustments. I removed myself as the default financial contact on Mom's hospital file and updated it to require joint authorization for future payment decisions. Not as punishment, simply as a boundary. I sent Daniel a clear, written summary of all medical payments made, including dates and totals, with a line at the bottom. For transparency going forward, professional tone, no emotion. He replied with, got it, 2 words, but different this time. Shorter, less expansive, less performative. At Christmas planning discussions, when budget allocations came up, he asked directly, Madison, what do you think makes sense financially? That sentence had never been framed as a question before. It had always been assumed. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was positional. At work, I often explained to junior analysts that leverage isn't about force. It's about information asymmetry. When both parties understand the full information set, dynamics equalize. Before Thanksgiving, Daniel operated under the comfort of assumed credit. After Thanksgiving, he operated under documented clarity. He couldn't claim full ownership of something publicly without knowing that records existed. And because I had delivered that clarity calmly, without humiliation, he had no villain to fight, only facts to absorb. That is the quiet power of composure. The consequences hadn't erupted yet, but they had begun. Because once someone knows you are no longer willing to absorb distortion silently, they behave differently around you. And that difference, subtle as it was, marked the true beginning of change. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived with an absence. Daniel became quieter in family spaces, not withdrawn, not cold, just more measured. The easy confidence he once carried into every room had a new filter over it. Before telling a story, he paused slightly, as if internally reviewing it for accuracy. That pause was new. At Sunday lunch 2 weeks later, my aunt brought up Mom's surgery again. We're just so grateful everything worked out, she said. You two really carried that. You two, plural. It was subtle, almost invisible, but language had shifted. Daniel nodded. Yeah, Madison handled the payments. I coordinated with the doctors. It was the first time I had heard him say it plainly. No embellishment, no rephrasing, just alignment. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't avoid it either. Mom glanced between us, thoughtful. The correction had begun to settle into collective memory. And here's the part no one talks about when narratives change. People feel disoriented. Not because they were malicious, but because they realized they accepted a simplified version too easily. Chloe called me later that evening. I feel kind of bad, she admitted. I didn't realize you had covered all of that. I just assumed she didn't finish the sentence. You just assumed Daniel did. It's okay, I said, and I meant it. We were all focused on Mom. But internally, I noted something important. Assumption thrives in silence, and silence, once removed, exposes it. The more interesting consequence, though, was financial. Daniel stopped asking me for short-term loans. Not dramatically, he just stopped. Whether it was pride, caution, or recalibration, I don't know. But for the first time in years, I wasn't the automatic liquidity source. Instead, he mentioned he was working with a bank on his next project. Good. He should. The shift wasn't punitive. It was structural. At work, I noticed something parallel happening inside me. I felt lighter, not vindicated, not triumphant, aligned. There's a unique calm that comes when your internal reality matches external acknowledgement. For years, I had been split, knowing the truth privately while allowing a different version publicly. That split consumes energy, and once it's resolved, you realize how much quiet tension you were carrying. But consequences are rarely one-sided. Daniel's social standing within the extended family didn't collapse. He was still charismatic, still capable, still loved. What changed was exclusivity. He was no longer the sole hero of that chapter, and that subtle redistribution of recognition altered his posture. He interrupted less. He deferred occasionally. He asked more questions before summarizing situations. Not submissive, just aware. Awareness is the beginning of accountability. One evening, he sent a longer message. I didn't mean to take credit. I guess I just fell into it. That was the closest he had come to admission. I reread the line carefully. Fell into it. Narratives don't just happen. They're allowed. I understand, I replied. It's fixed now. 3 words. Not accusatory. Not forgiving dramatically. Just factual. It's fixed now. And it was. Because once recognition follows the receipt, the imbalance begins correcting itself naturally. No shouting required. No revenge necessary. Just clarity, calmly maintained. If Thanksgiving was the correction, December was the reckoning. Not dramatic, not explosive, but internal. Daniel came over one evening under the pretense of dropping off some mail that had been delivered to his old address. My house, back when he had briefly listed it for business registration convenience. He stood in my kitchen, hands in his coat pockets, looking slightly less certain than usual. I didn't realize how it looked, he said without sitting down. Looked. That word again. Framing everything as perception. It wasn't about how it looked, I replied calmly. It was about what happened. He nodded, but his jaw tightened. You could have just talked to me instead of putting that slide up. There it was, the lingering sting. I met his eyes evenly. I did talk to you, before Thanksgiving. He exhaled. He knew I was right. What unsettled him wasn't exposure. It was a loss of control over the narrative. For years, he had been the one who summarized events for the family, the spokesperson, the translator of chaos into a digestible story. And now he understood something irreversible. I was willing to let documentation exist publicly. That meant any future exaggeration carried risk. That awareness changed him. But it also created something else. Regret. Not necessarily regret for misrepresenting the truth. Regret for miscalculating me. I feel like people look at me differently now, he admitted. And there it was. The quiet panic. Not because he had been humiliated. No one had attacked him. No one had accused him publicly. But because he realized that his credibility was no longer unquestioned. Trust once adjusted doesn't snap back to its previous shape. It's not about looking different, I said. It's about being accurate. He leaned against the counter. I wasn't trying to steal anything from you. I believed him. That's the uncomfortable part. He hadn't set out to deceive. He had simply occupied the space I left open. And when someone lives in open space long enough, they begin to think it belongs to them. You didn't steal it, I replied. You just didn't correct it. Silence. That sentence landed heavier than an accusation would have, because correction requires awareness, and awareness requires humility. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit from childhood. I wish you'd said something sooner. That one was honest, and it revealed something deeper. He wasn't upset about the truth. He was upset about the timing, because timing determines power. Had I corrected him immediately after the first Facebook post, it would have been a small edit. By Thanksgiving, it became a public recalibration, and recalibrations are harder to digest. It wouldn't have changed anything sooner, I said quietly. You weren't ready to hear it then. He didn't argue. He couldn't, because we both knew that if I had challenged the narrative while Mom was still recovering, he would have framed it as selfishness. Now, with documentation calmly presented, the space for denial was gone. Too late to fix it quietly. Too late to reshape the memory without acknowledgement. That's the thing about records. They don't shout. They endure. And once they've been seen, they become part of the architecture. He left that night subdued. not defeated, but aware. And awareness, once awakened, cannot be undone. The real confrontation didn't happen in my kitchen. It happened 3 weeks later, in my mother's living room, with the afternoon light falling softly across the carpet. Mom had asked both of us to come over. Her tone on the phone had been gentle but firm, the way it used to be when we were children, and she sensed tension before we admitted it. We sat facing each other across the coffee table. No raised voices, no audience, just clarity waiting to settle. I need to understand what happened, Mom began. Not the slideshow, not the Facebook post, the heart of it. She looked at Daniel first. He straightened slightly. I handled the hospital coordination, he said carefully. Insurance calls, scheduling, paperwork. True. Then she looked at me. And you? I transferred the funds, I said. All of them. No embellishment. No emotional charge. Mom nodded slowly. I didn't realize that. I know. That was the part that mattered. Not accusation, not correction. Just acknowledgement of reality. Daniel shifted. I wasn't trying to take credit, he said. People just assumed. Mom's gaze stayed steady. And did you correct them? Silence. That question hung in the room longer than anything else had. He looked down briefly. Not really. There it was. No shouting. No defensiveness left to hide behind. Just a small admission. Mom leaned back in her chair. I raised you both better than that. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Shame delivered calmly is more powerful than anger delivered loudly. I'm not angry, she continued, but I don't want either of you carrying resentment. I spoke before Daniel could respond. I'm not resentful, I said honestly. I just don't want to disappear in stories that involve me. That sentence felt like the distilled version of everything. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me. I didn't think you cared about that stuff. Recognition. That's what this had always been about, not applause. Accuracy. I care about truth, I replied. The room settled. Mom reached for both of our hands. You're both strong, she said softly, in different ways. But strength doesn't compete, it complements. No one argued. No one defended. There was nothing left to fight about, because the facts had already been established. This wasn't a battle for dominance. It was a recalibration of respect. Daniel cleared his throat. I should have said something sooner, he admitted quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But it was real. And real lasts longer than spectacle. I nodded once. That's all. No demand for apology beyond that. No demand for restitution. The confrontation ended not with resolution theatrics, but with alignment. When we stood to leave, the air felt lighter. Not because everything had been perfectly repaired, but because nothing was distorted anymore. And distortion, once removed, takes tension with it. That is what confrontation without heat looks like. No flames, just light. It's been almost a year since that Thanksgiving. Nothing dramatic followed. No estrangement, no permanent fracture, no family war stories retold in whispers. What changed wasn't our closeness. It was my posture within it. For most of my life, I mistook invisibility for humility. I believed that if my work spoke for itself, that would be enough. That love didn't need acknowledgement. That contribution didn't need naming. But a contribution without naming becomes an assumption. An assumption becomes hierarchy. Today, when financial conversations arise, I speak early. Not forcefully, clearly. If I fund something, I state it plainly. If I coordinate something, I state that too. Not as self-promotion, as documentation. There's a difference. Daniel and I are different now. He still tells stories. He still fills rooms easily. But he pauses more. He includes details he used to gloss over. Last month, at a small family gathering, someone mentioned Mom's recovery again. Daniel said, Madison covered the surgery costs. I handled the logistics. We made a good team. It was simple, accurate, balanced, and I didn't feel a surge of triumph hearing it. I felt steady. Mom treats me differently, too. Not with guilt, but with awareness. She asks before assuming. She listens longer when I explain things. There's an attentiveness that wasn't there before. Chloe, interestingly, began checking her own patterns. She's apologized more quickly when she interrupts. She gives credit intentionally now. Clarity spreads. Not because it forces people to change, but because it removes the comfort of distortion. As for me, the biggest shift wasn't external. It was internal. I no longer shrink to preserve comfort. I no longer downplay achievements to make them easier to digest. And I no longer confuse silence with strength. Strength can be quiet, but it is never erased. The $86,000 I transferred rebuilt itself over time. Savings grow back. Investments compound. Money is fluid. But self-respect, once recalibrated, compounds faster. If I could summarize who I am now, it would be this. I'm still steady, still analytical, still calm under pressure, but I am no longer background. Recognition should follow the receipt, not because I need applause, but because truth deserves alignment. And when alignment exists, relationships feel lighter, not heavier. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It isn't about overpowering someone. It's about standing still long enough that reality becomes undeniable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't burn bridges. I simply let the record exist. And that changed everything. If you've stayed with me this long, you might have expected a more dramatic ending, a public apology, a shattered relationship, a moment of cinematic humiliation. But real power rarely looks like that. Real power looks like composure. It looks like documentation. It looks like telling the truth without trying to wound anyone. When my brother took credit for funding our mother's surgery, I had a choice. I could have exploded in the hospital hallway. I could have posted a defensive comment online. I could have stayed silent forever and let the story calcify. Instead, I waited. I gathered the facts. I chose the timing, and I let the receipt speak. Not to embarrass him, not to punish him, but to realign the narrative. Recognition should follow the receipt. That principle isn't about money. It's about ownership, of effort, of sacrifice, of contribution. When we allow our work to be absorbed quietly into someone else's spotlight, we teach people how to treat us. And when we correct that gently but firmly, we teach them something else. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to be humiliated to be respected. You don't have to destroy a relationship to redefine your place within it. Quiet dominance is not revenge. It's alignment. And alignment feels peaceful, not explosive. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. Silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen. When silence protects distortion, it erodes you. When silence is paired with documentation and timing, it strengthens you. So I want to leave you with a question. Have you ever let someone take credit for something you built because correcting them felt uncomfortable? And if you did, what would happen if you calmly released the receipt? I'd love to hear your story in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.